The morning air over northern France was still thick with dust. Columns of American tanks stretched across narrow country roads. Engines roared, tracks crushed hedgerows. Infantry rode on armored hulls, their uniforms coated in gray powder from days of continuous movement. At the front of it all was the Third Army, commanded by George S. Patton. Since the breakout from Normandy, Patton's forces had been moving almost without pause. Town after town fell with little resistance. German defenses, already shaken by Operation Cobra, were collapsing faster than Allied planners had expected. Then came the reports. One message reached Allied headquarters. Another followed, and then a third. Patton's spearhead had advanced over 150 kilometers in just 36 hours, far beyond the planned line, far beyond the expected pace. At Supreme Headquarters, Dwight D. Eisenhower studied the map quietly. The frontline markers had shifted dramatically overnight. Units that were meant to move cautiously were now deep inside French territory. The advance was bold. It was aggressive. And it had not been fully authorized, because in the summer of 1944, speed could win the war, but speed could also stretch an army beyond its limits, and that was the danger now unfolding across France. To understand how this moment happened, the story begins weeks earlier, when the Allied armies first broke free from Normandy. By late July 1944, the war in Western Europe had reached a turning point. For nearly 7 weeks after Normandy landings, Allied forces had struggled to break from a narrow beachhead in northern France. The terrain favored the defenders. Thick hedgerows, sunken roads in small villages allowed German forces to slow the Allied advance. Progress came slowly, sometimes only a few hundred meters per day. German divisions, though weakened, fought stubbornly. Units under Gerd von Rundstedt and later Gunther von Kluge attempted to hold the Allied armies in place long enough to rebuild defensive lines deeper in France. But Allied planners were preparing something larger. On August 1, 1944, the U.S. Third Army became operational under George S. Patton. Patton had spent weeks preparing quietly, waiting for the breakthrough that would allow him to unleash mobile warfare across France. When the opportunity came, he moved immediately. Patton believed in speed. He believed in momentum, and most importantly, he believed that a retreating enemy should never be allowed to recover. German forces were already withdrawing. Roads were crowded with retreating vehicles. Communications were breaking down. Entire units were moving without coordination. Patton saw what others saw as chaos, but to him, it was opportunity. Within hours, Third Army units pushed south and west, then turned east. Towns fell quickly. Bridges were captured before German engineers could destroy them. American armored columns began moving deeper into France. At Allied headquarters, the reports sounded promising, but few expected how fast Patton intended to move. Because once the breakout began, Patton was no longer thinking about Normandy. He was thinking about Germany. By early August 1944, the German front in France was no longer stable. American armored divisions under George S. Patton were advancing at a pace rarely seen in the European theater. Entire regions of western France were falling with limited resistance. German formations, already weakened after Operation Cobra, were struggling to regroup. Patton's Third Army moved in multiple directions at once. One column pushed toward Brittany, another advanced eastward, a third moved south to secure crossings and road networks. The goal was simple: keep the enemy off balance. But at Supreme Allied headquarters, the situation looked different. Dwight D. Eisenhower was responsible for the entire Allied front, not just one army. British forces under Bernard Montgomery were advancing in the north. American forces under Omar Bradley coordinated movements in the center. The Allied plan relied on coordination. Supplies had to be shared. Fuel had to be distributed carefully. Bridges and roads needed to support multiple advancing armies. And this was becoming a growing concern. Patton's rapid advance was beginning to stretch logistics. Fuel trucks struggled to keep up with armored spearheads. Ammunition columns fell behind. Maintenance crews found it difficult to repair vehicles moving almost continuously. Despite these challenges, Patton continued to push forward. German resistance remained scattered. Intelligence reports indicated confusion among German commanders. Retreating units were abandoning equipment. Entire defensive lines were collapsing before they could be formed. To Patton, this was the moment to press harder. To Eisenhower, it was a moment requiring caution. The Allied advance across France depended not just on speed, but on sustainability. A single overextended army could become vulnerable if German forces regrouped. Meanwhile, German command was attempting to stabilize the front. Adolf Hitler ordered counterattacks. German armored units were redirected towards threatened sectors. Defensive lines were planned along rivers and natural barriers. But these plans required time that Patton's advance was denying them. By mid-August, American spearheads were moving faster than expected. Reports indicated rapid gains across hundreds of kilometers. Roads behind the front were filled with advancing Allied vehicles. And then came the numbers. Patton's leading units had advanced approximately 150 kilometers in just 36 hours. It was a remarkable achievement. It was also a strategic gamble. Because while Patton's forces were racing forward, the rest of the Allied front struggled to maintain pace, and the distance between aggressive advance and dangerous isolation was beginning to shrink. The moment of decision was approaching. Mid-August 1944. The roads across France were no longer battle lines. They had become corridors of movement. Columns of American tanks rolled eastward almost without pause. Dust clouds stretched for miles behind them. Fuel trucks raced forward, trying to catch up with armored spearheads already far ahead. At the front were reconnaissance units of the U.S. Third Army, commanded by George S. Patton. Patton's doctrine was simple: keep moving. If resistance was weak, advance. If resistance appeared, bypass it. If roads were blocked, find another. This approach created momentum that German forces struggled to stop. Town after town fell before defenses could be organized. Bridges were captured intact. Retreating German columns were caught mid-movement. By August, the German army in France was no longer conducting an orderly withdrawal. It was attempting to escape. American armored divisions pushed forward day and night. Crews slept inside tanks. Infantry rode on vehicles to keep pace. Engineers cleared obstacles quickly to maintain speed. Radio reports began to arrive at higher headquarters. Positions updated rapidly. Distances increased. Then came the realization. Patton's leading units had advanced nearly 150 kilometers in just 36 hours. It was a remarkable achievement. It was also a strategic gamble. Because while Patton's forces were racing forward, the rest of the Allied front struggled to maintain pace, and the distance between aggressive advance and dangerous isolation was beginning to shrink. The moment of decision was approaching. Far ahead. At the front were reconnaissance units of the U.S. Third Army, commanded by George S. Patton. Patton's doctrine was simple: keep moving. If resistance was weak, advance. If resistance appeared, bypass it. If roads were blocked, find another. This approach created momentum that German forces struggled to stop. Town after town fell before defenses could be organized. Bridges were captured intact. Retreating German columns were caught mid-movement. By August, the German army in France was no longer conducting an orderly withdrawal. It was attempting to escape. American armored divisions pushed forward day and night. Crews slept inside tanks. Infantry rode on vehicles to keep pace. Engineers cleared obstacles quickly to maintain speed. Radio reports began to arrive at higher headquarters. Positions updated rapidly. Distances increased. Then came the realization. Patton's leading units had advanced nearly 150 kilometers in just 36 hours. This pace was extraordinary. it also meant something else. Patton's forces were now far ahead of neighboring Allied formations. Supply lines stretched longer. Fuel deliveries became uncertain. Communications grew more complicated. At command headquarters, Omar Bradley monitored the situation closely. Bradley understood Patton's style: aggressive, fast, and focused on exploitation. But Bradley also knew the risks. Meanwhile, at Supreme Headquarters, Dwight Eisenhower reviewed operational maps showing the expanding front. The Third Army's advance stood out. It moved farther, faster, and beyond the expected operational boundaries. German resistance remained limited, but intelligence warned that enemy forces were regrouping along defensive terrain, particularly near rivers and natural barriers further east. But Patton saw opportunity. The German army was retreating. Momentum was on the Allied side, and in Patton's view, slowing down now could allow Germany to recover. So the advance continued, and with every kilometer gained, the distance between bold maneuver and dangerous overextension became thinner, setting the stage for a decision at the highest level of Allied command. As reports continued to arrive, the scale of the advance became clearer. Maps at Supreme Headquarters were updated repeatedly. Frontline markers shifted deeper into France. Staff officers measured distances again, confirming what seemed almost improbable. The Third Army had advanced far beyond the planned operational tempo. At the center of the decision-making structure stood Dwight Eisenhower. Eisenhower's responsibility was not limited to one army. He had to balance British forces in the north, American armies in the center, and supply routes stretching back to the beaches of Normandy. Every kilometer forward increased pressure on logistics. Fuel was already becoming a critical concern. Allied supply lines still depended heavily on the ports in Normandy. Truck convoys traveled long distances across crowded roads. Bridges damaged during the fighting created bottlenecks. Maintenance crews struggled to keep vehicles operational. Meanwhile, George Patton continued advancing. Reconnaissance units reported minimal resistance. German formations were withdrawing rapidly. Roads eastward appeared open. The possibility of pushing deeper, perhaps even towards the German border, seemed within reach. But Eisenhower saw the situation differently. An overextended army could become vulnerable if German forces regrouped. Fuel shortages could halt tanks in exposed positions. Coordination with neighboring armies might break down. This was not just a tactical decision, it was strategic. Omar Bradley, who commanded the 12th Army Group, was also closely involved. Bradley understood Patton's momentum, but recognized the growing logistical strain. By this point, Patton's spearheads were operating far ahead of their supply lines. Fuel shortages began to appear at forward units. Some armored columns slowed. Others waited for resupply. The speed that had defined the advance now began to encounter its first limits. German forces, meanwhile, used the time to reorganize. Defensive positions formed along the Moselle River and in Lorraine. What had been a rapid pursuit now turned into a series of difficult battles. Eisenhower focused on balancing supplies across all Allied armies. Momentum shifted from speed to sustained pressure across the entire front, and the 150-kilometer advance became both a symbol of opportunity and a reminder of the limits of rapid warfare. By late August 1944, the rapid advance began to slow. Fuel shortages forced George Patton's Third Army to halt repeatedly. German forces used this pause to regroup along the Moselle River and in Lorraine. What had been a rapid pursuit now turned into a series of difficult battles. Eisenhower focused on balancing supplies across all Allied armies. Momentum shifted from speed to sustained pressure across the entire front, and the 150-kilometer advance became both a symbol of opportunity and a reminder of the limits of rapid warfare. German defenses gradually strengthened, slowing George Patton's advance across eastern France. Heavy fighting in Lorraine replaced the earlier rapid movement. Eisenhower's coordinated strategy stabilized the Allied front. The war continued forward, slower but more controlled.
and Patton's bold 150-kilometer advance remained one of the fastest and most debated moves of the Allied campaign in France. Patton's 150-kilometer dash showed the power of audacity in warfare. Eisenhower's measured caution highlighted the importance of coordination and logistics. The clash of speed versus strategy defined the Allied advance across France. It was a moment where boldness met responsibility on the battlefield, and it remains a defining lesson in leadership, momentum, and the limits of rapid war.